Now I'll call my colleague Melissa Franks from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies to introduce our next speaker.
Well, it is really my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karen Rook. Dr. Rook, as Ken mentioned earlier, is an excellent choice for this symposium today because she is a leading scholar in the area of social relationships and health. She is a distinguished professor, now emerita, at the University of California, Irvine, where she has made significant contributions to research, teaching, and service for over 3 decades. Now, early in her career, her scholarship advanced the study of social relationships in health by drawing attention to the potential health consequences of problematic ties with others. And for the students in the room, I want to point out that this work was from her doctoral dissertation, and according to Google Scholar, it's been cited nearly 2,000 times. And her work continues to advance the understanding of how social ties can benefit and sometimes detract from our health and well-being. And her careful approach to addressing challenging questions has been recognized through numerous awards, and including the very recent Baltus Distinguished Research Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association. And she's also been recognized for her excellence in working across disciplines to tackle difficult questions. And again, I especially want to recognize the awards that she has received for her teaching and mentorship of young scholars, and to point out that I have the good fortune of being among those scholars who has benefited for a very long time from her generous collaboration and her mentorship. And just a little bit of inside story, I've also benefited a great deal from her great taste in travel, food, and fun. Although you won't know it from her productivity and her excellence in research, teaching, mentoring, she doesn't work all the time. So in her talk today, Dr. Rook will address the ways in which older adults reorganize their lives in response to the loss of a close relationship. And this work on social network substitution and compensation offers another theoretically rich context for discovering how our day-to-day interactions with important others can impact our health and happiness. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Rook.
Thank you very much for that introduction, wonderful introduction, Melissa. And you can see why Melissa has long been a member of my personal social network and academic social network and will be for a very long time. No need to worry about losses and replacements in this case. You're in. So it's really a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank Ken Ferraro and the other symposium organizers for inviting me to come here today. I'm enjoying learning about the center. It's amazing. I wish we had such a center at UC Irvine. We kind of never got our act together to put together a broadly focused center on aging. And you have really rich veins of talent in this center and the faculty, outstanding faculty and also outstanding students. So I've been learning from you and look forward to continuing to do that during the rest of my visit. I should also say that this is an occasion when I wish I had time to revise some of my slides after hearing Ben's outstanding talk. There's quite a bit for me to think about, in terms of the change that you're documenting, changes you've documented, and losses and replacements and how all of that works. So there's some synergy, but also interesting points of discussion. So what I would like to do is to emphasize a puzzle that I talk about, a puzzle I've been thinking about for quite a while, which is social network compensation in later life. And it's motivated by a large body of work that Ken mentioned and Ben mentioned, documenting the very important role that social relationships play in our lives, contributing to health, contributing to mental health, happiness, quality of life. So it raises the question of what happens when people lose an important social tie. And loss can occur at any age, but it is especially likely to occur in later adulthood. So here are some data that illustrate that. Some data indicating that the loss of friends is a very common event in later adulthood, with 25% of people aged 65 and older in one study reporting that they had lost a friend in the past year. If we look at a little older age group, age 85 and older, 59% of men and 42% of women had lost a close friend in the past year. The loss of a spouse is also a common experience in later adulthood, and you can see from these data that rates are especially high among women, but they're also high among older men. And these rates increase if we look at the oldest old, and you see this both in terms of the loss of friends and also the loss of a spouse, really strikingly high rates of spousal loss in later life. So this might lead us to wonder what loneliness looks like in later adulthood. Okay, I worked hard to get this animation right, so let me ask you what you might predict if you were to look at the relationship between mean levels of loneliness and age across the life course. So starting from age 18 to 25, sort of young adulthood. And these data only go up to age 70. Any hunches, increases, decreases, stability? I'll give you the punchline. Okay, surprisingly, this was a surprise to many people when data like this first began to appear. What? Loneliness is decreasing across the life course and into old age. Now, I want to note, you will have brightly spotted this, that stopping the data collection at age 70 is not the best way to get a grip on what the course might look like, course of loneliness might look like in later life. There are some other data that are more recent than this that actually mirror this kind of pattern as well. Also data that truncated the sample selection early on. If we extend the data and begin to bring in the oldest old, you see a different pattern. So you see the sort of either stability or a decrease in loneliness until sort of the 70s, and in advanced old age, then a marked increase in loneliness. These are some older data, but I can show you recent data. Hopefully these are clear in the back. Presented by Hockley and her colleagues in a paper that's in press that mirror this pattern of a sort of decrease in loneliness and then an upturn in advanced old age. And the vulnerability of the old, as most of you would know already, can be seen in many domains of functioning. It's not limited to, but certainly does include widowhood and loneliness. So some scholars of widowhood talk about two fundamental adaptations. Here I'm thinking about some of the work by Strobe and their colleagues in what has come to be called the dual process model of coping with bereavement. On the one hand, there's the task of coping with the emotional distress, the acute grief, the sense of loss. There's also the task of reorganizing one's lives, including social lives, and this is referred to as a period of restoration. So that's often thought of as something that occurs later, after the acute period of grappling with the most intense grief. Although there can be some oscillation between these two tasks as people adapt to the loss of a partner. What I'm going to focus on today is this second facet of the adaptation to widowhood, the reorganizing lives, which can include social lives. And a common assumption guiding this work is that social needs previously met by the partner persist after the loss. Some of those needs for intimacy, companionship, emotional support persist, and that might then drive social network compensation. It doesn't mean, and we'll return to this later briefly, that social needs or aspirations are static or unchanging over time. They might, in fact, change. So we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But it's plausible then to imagine that loneliness, the loneliness that can occur after the loss of a spouse, might function as a driving force for social network compensation. And these are some quotes from older widowed men, not necessarily to make an argument at this point about gender differences. These were just, I think, poignant quotes that I was able to pull from a couple of different studies. So one older man said, "Since my wife died, I'm very alone. All my friends have either died or they were my wife's friends. I have nobody." Another one commented, when my wife died, I didn't know what to do with myself, the aloneness, everything. Now I can't find any suitable companions. I don't visit anybody and nobody visits me. This is the worst kind of life. So sad, right? And you can imagine then that loneliness might drive social network compensation. So the purpose of this talk is to examine social network compensation following the loss of a partner. And the overarching question that I'd like to explore today is to what extent and via what processes might older adults seek to compensate for the loss of a major social tie, such as a primary partner. And the specific questions that I'll try to explore include, what does compensation mean in the interpersonal domain? What is it? How has it been conceptualized? To what extent can older adults derive support and companionship from alternative sources following the loss of a partner? How effectively do the alternative sources of support and companionship function to sustain older adults' well-being? It's a different question than just the question of substitution per se, right? And then when alternative sources of support and companionship are not available or not effective, what other compensatory processes might serve to preserve well-being? So let's begin by thinking about what compensation means in the interpersonal domain, and it can be helpful to ask how it's been defined more generally in the psychological literature, with apologies to my sociological colleagues. So I hope are going to keep me on my toes today, and that's one of the reasons I was excited to come here, because there's such great sociologists doing work on these questions. So in the psychological literature, it's defined as behavior that's meant to counteract the negative effects of irreversible deficits or losses, typically deficits in an individual's capacity, so sensory decline, mobility declines, cognitive declines, and so forth. And compensatory processes can be distinguished from compensatory outcomes. So the processes refer to substituting an alternative means of goal attainment. And if that's not successful, modifying the goals, substituting alternative goals or goal standards, right? And that's thought to preserve well-being or continued goal pursuit. But importantly, that's an empirical question, right? Do those substitutive processes actually function to preserve well-being? And we'll see that, in fact, in the literature, that distinction is often blurred, and that's very much true in this interpersonal domain as well. So if we extrapolate from this broader psychological literature, compensation in the interpersonal domain would be defined as behavior meant to counteract the negative effects of a key relationship loss. And the compensatory processes, again, are distinct from compensatory outcomes, but these are often not distinguished in the literature. Simply assumed that a substitute tie, a replacement tie, functions to preserve well-being. And I think it's really important it's a simple idea, but it's really important to examine whether or not that's the case. And then, of course, under what circumstances is it the case? Some additional assumptions in this literature on social network compensation include the notion that the loss of a primary partner often prompts people to turn to others as alternative or substitute sources of support and companionship. And I'm going to take a little sidebar here to talk briefly about companionship. So studies often assess support, emotional support, instrumental support, but overlook companionship, shared leisure, visits, humor, joking with others, hanging out, essentially adult play. And yet companionship makes unique and substantial contributions to well-being. And I think it's sometimes overlooked because it's such a common part of everyday life. We don't think that it needs to be assessed in some sense, but I think it does need to be captured in our studies and assessed. And it may make different contributions to well-being than does instrumental support or emotional support. So let's take a quick detour and talk a little bit about companionship, and I'll come back to the main theme. So this is a model that I've used for some time to think about how one might distinguish some of the health-related functions of social networks, focusing first on, or today, only on the health-preserving functions, nothing about the dark side today. I'm happy to chat about it at lunch, of course. So I've distinguished, along with some colleagues, between social support, emphasizing emotional support, instrumental support, and companionship. So it's the shared leisure activities, the enjoyable humor, the shared rituals, and then social control. A lot of work I've done with my colleague Melissa on this topic. And that refers to social influence attempts, so others in the network who try to exert some pressure on you to modify a behavior, for example, to give up health compromising behavior and to engage in more health protective behavior. I'm not going to focus on this last function today, but I think it does suggest a possible link to the poor self-care and nutrition that is sometimes seen in widowed older adults. So a little bit more about companionship. This is sort of a conceptual analysis trying to draw some distinctions between companionship and support. And this is mostly theoretical. I don't have a great deal of empirical support for this, but it's worth thinking about. So I think some distinctions include the notion that companionship entails an egalitarian relationship between people. You come together as equals, essentially. There's not a helper and a help recipient, which is more typical of support transactions, where there is a kind of implied hierarchy. Companionship is often proactive. It's something that people seek out for the pursuit of pleasure and camaraderie. So you can ask yourself, what do you enjoy doing on the weekends? You know, it's probably, for many of us, not just young adults, getting together with others to socialize. And what's driving that, for the most part, I think, is this, again, pursuit of mutually enjoyable pleasure, camaraderie. Support, in contrast, and I'm kind of drawing in some extremes here, but it's not always reactive, but it's often reactive and is motivated as a response to stress, so that people turn to others when they need help solving a problem, getting advice, and so forth. So it's kind of a different kettle of fish. Companionship then is undertaken for intrinsic enjoyment, support undertaken for problem solving, advice, regulation of distress. Companionship has the quality that it often involves spontaneity and playfulness and novelty, and these are all factors that can boost emotional well-being, elevate it. And support less often has those qualities. It less often involves pleasurable interaction and tends to restore rather than to boost well-being per se. I think it's also plausible that being desired as a companion, being invited, right, to take part in companionship, being included in social activities, is a very tangible way that others convey their regard. They're choosing to spend their free time with you. And that can affirm self-worth, I think, very concretely. Receiving support, on the other hand, doesn't always do this, but it can convey that you have limited coping abilities to some extent, and it can undermine self-worth. Not always, but it has that potential, and there's some interesting work by Bolger and colleagues that suggests that may be the case. So there are some additional assumptions in the literature on social network compensation. Compensatory responses are often conscious and deliberate, thoughtful, planful, but they may be unconscious in some respects. So an example from Hilda Peplau, given many years ago, would be something like a lonely widower who lingers unconsciously in interactions with neighbors to meet companionship needs. So just extends the chatting over the fence, the interaction, not planning to say, I need a companion, I need to fulfill the loss of companionship in my life, but just sort of unconsciously gravitating to others for that purpose. And I've already said the compensatory responses do not guarantee compensatory benefits. So that's a key point, and I think something that's necessary to advance this literature. Why might that be the case? So support from alternative sources might be less sensitive or less readily available than was true of the partner, right, who's no longer here. Companionship provided by adult children sometimes has qualities of being obligatory or less enjoyable. So the alternative sources perform these functions, but they may not confer some of the same psychological benefits as was the case when those functions were performed by the partner. And unsuccessful compensation may require adaptation in its own right. So if people are trying to turn to others to seek companionship or seek emotional support or instrumental support, and that doesn't work, if it's not successful, that can be something that prompts a need for adaptation in its own right. So with that kind of as a theoretical background, let's think a little bit about to what extent can widowed older adults derive support and companionship from alternative sources. And I'm going to define some different types of substitution. I've seen these distinctions in Ben's work as well. And I want to say at the outset, none of this is meant to imply that we can readily replace, or really perhaps ever replace, a truly intimate, long-term, close relationship. I don't mean to be as crass as to suggest that one just simply swaps in, a new social network member to replace a spouse. But nonetheless, people do seek to reorganize their social lives, and Ben has made that case nicely today, so there is change. And to some extent, these are conceptualized as substitute sources of support and companionship. So some different types of substitution that have been defined in the literature include forming enduring new social ties. I said enduring just to distinguish it from the very, very brief, tie that might be established otherwise. And in the literature, this excludes remarriage, and that's because the focus of the compensation literature is on irreversible deficits, such as living indefinitely without a partner. Okay, so that's remarriage would be seen as removing the deficit, reversing it, rather than helping the person to cope with an ongoing change or deficit in their lives. Rekindling dormant ties is another type of substitution that's sometimes considered. You could think of a friend from graduate school, who you might have as a kind of dormant tie that you could resurrect at some point. So these are ties that one has, but they're not particularly active at the time that this loss in the network occurs. Intensifying existing social ties is another kind of substitution. So these are ties that are known, but they take on new functions, new properties. So they're called upon or they volunteer themselves to perform a wider range of functions. And so they alter the character of the tie. There might be other kinds of substitution that should be considered. And so there's a lot of room for both theoretical and empirical work on most of these constructs. But these are some that have been considered to date. So we'll take a look at a few empirical observations or demonstrations, I guess, of these distinctions. So if we look at research that has simply compared sources of support among widowed versus married older adults, we can see findings like these. Compared to the married, the widowed derive more support from their adult children, and if they're childless, from siblings and other relatives. And they report more socializing with neighbors. But this could reflect monitoring and support mobilization by others, rather than widowed individuals' efforts to form substitute ties themselves. So we might try to find evidence of purposeful formation of new social ties, and I'll give you a couple of examples of studies that have done that. One is a nice study by LaMay and colleagues. In this study, they included older adults who had been widowed 10 years or less, and they asked them about, this is retrospective, but they asked them to reflect on any efforts that they might have made, deliberate efforts to forge new social ties after the death of the spouse. And of those who did make deliberate efforts, so some said yes and some said no, I didn't make any such efforts, but of those who made deliberate efforts, 44% were successful, so 44% established new social ties. But something for us to think about is that means that 56% were unsuccessful. Again, what does that mean? These are people who were deliberately trying to forge new ties by their own account. 56% said no, I didn't succeed. So that's something to think about. So substitute ties can include more than just new ties, which was the focus of this research. What did you do to try? Did you try to make new ties, and were you successful? So we'll mention a study that sought to examine distinct types of substitute ties and also then to explore their associations with well-being, because that's a crucial theme again in this talk. We can't just assume that the substitute ties confer benefits on well-being. They may, and may often do that, but it is an empirical question whether or not they do. So this was a study done with a former graduate student that looked at social network substitution and compensation in a sample of older widowed women. Substitution, again, was forming new ties. We looked at 3 types: forming new ties, rekindling dormant ties, or intensifying existing ties. And these were types of ties that were inferred from the duration of the tie, the degree to which there had been contact with that individual before the spouse passed away, and afterwards, or only afterwards in some cases, and then the specific support functions that were performed. Then we also examined compensation. We did this by trying to look at the extent to which these different kinds of substitute social ties were associated with changes in the widow's depression and loneliness. The study design consisted of tracking 3 groups of widowed individuals, all age 60 and older, whose duration of widowhood had differed. So there was an interest in trying to see whether different processes came into play relatively soon after the loss of a spouse, 3 to 6 months, versus later, 15 to 18 months, or further on in the course of adapting to widowhood, 27 to 30 months. So the social networks and the emotional health of the participants were assessed pretty intensively, I think 6 times over a 1-year period. So we did find that many widows appeared to establish substitute ties, and you can see from these data, if you have a chance to orient yourself to the graph, there's the types of ties rather appear along the bottom, and the frequency with which they were established by the newer widows, the ones widowed only 3 to 6 months, versus those who'd been widowed for an intermediate period or a longer time, are reflected in each of the different bars. And you can see in general that the rekindled ties were the most common type of change in the social network, followed by the intensified ties, and to a lesser extent, the new ties. So the widows in this study were kind of calling upon people who were known to some extent before the spouse passed away, either trying to resurrect a kind of dormant tie or trying to intensify and have the adult children, for example, take on new functions or siblings. New ties were reported in some cases. Again, they didn't report them as, I formed a new tie. We inferred the newness of the tie from the patterns of network data over time. So they did form some new ties, not to the same extent as the other kinds, and this was the least common among the widows who had been widowed just a short period of time. So then the question is, did these social ties contribute to the women's psychological health? And here there was a surprise for us. The substitute ties were not associated with gains in the widow's emotional health, and on the contrary, controlling for their psychological health at time 1, we found that women who had more rekindled or intensified social ties over the 1-year period reported more depressive symptoms. Okay, so there was more rather than fewer depressive symptoms reported. And then there was greater loneliness among the widows who formed new social ties over the 1-year period. So this was basically opposite, right, to what we would have expected to see. And that's a puzzle, right? Why did we not see compensation? What was going on? So these are some of the ideas. There are probably a few others that are discussed in the paper that was published, but one of the most obvious interpretations might be, well, it was their depression that drove, maybe their initial depression, their initial loneliness was driving them to try to forge these new ties, and that's what you're detecting. You're just detecting that the more depressed people were still depressed. And we tried to look at that by examining the extent to which the baseline measures of psychological health predicted any of these kinds of substitution. We just didn't find any evidence for that in post hoc analyses. And it's also possible that new, or by new I mean also rekindled ties, ties that have been altered in some way, might need more time to solidify before they can confer benefits. This study was a study that lasted 1 year, and maybe that's not enough time for especially perhaps new ties. There's, tentative formation of a new tie, and maybe it takes more time than than we had available to us in the study to be able to detect what could be benefits. Now, a critique I would make of myself in offering this explanation is this doesn't explain why the effects were negative. This might explain if you saw a pattern of no results, but not negative. So the mystery continues. Substitution can entail risks of rejection, trying to reach out to others, trying to forge, a fledgling relationship with someone. And it may be hard to face without the encouragement of a close network member. And there's a researcher in the Netherlands named Stevens who's done some really interesting studies that suggest that lonely older adults benefit a bit more from interventions that are aimed at trying to help them forge ties if they already have at least some degree of support in the network, somebody to kind of support them through what can be a potentially risky undertaking. Another possibility is that something called relationship specialization, which I want to spend a little bit of time talking with you about, may impose constraints on effective substitution. So what is this thing? Okay. So let's take a closer look at relationship specialization. And I thought it might start with a little thought exercise for the audience to see if you can have some just intuitive sense of this. And you may have actually also heard this term before. But if you needed to borrow $5,000, would you be likely to ask a friend to loan this to you? Would you be likely to ask a family member to loan this to you? So my hunch is that more of you would be comfortable asking a family member than a friend, right? And so I think I actually saw a raised eyebrow or two when I said friend. And if you feel like that makes you a little queasy to contemplate that, or it seems uncomfortable or odd, that's the very notion of the relationship specialization, that there's some kind of norms that we've acquired that tell us this is not an appropriate source to turn to for that kind of support. Let's try one more. So if you wanted to get together with someone to socialize and enjoy yourself on the weekend, would you be likely to invite your parent? Would you be likely to invite a friend? Okay, again, I think more of you, probably would opt for a friend. And of course, these aren't rules and nothing is hard and fast, but if you had these reactions, then you already have an intuitive feeling for what relationship specialization is. So it's the notion that, and this comes from Weiss and sociologist Litwack, some many years ago, the notion that social network ties perform key functions that sustain well-being, but more importantly, different people perform different functions. So primary partners, in fact, perform multiple functions, but others tend to provide more specialized function. That's sort of the reasoning, the theoretical reasoning that was put forward quite some time ago. And that beyond that, the patterns of socialization are not random, but rather implicit norms shape the pattern of specialization. Did I say specialization? So kin are often cited as most likely to be the key sources of instrumental support and non-intimate emotional support, but less often companionship. In contrast, non-kin, and especially friends, are viewed as key sources of companionship and intimate emotional support, but less often instrumental support. So those would be examples of relationship specialization that's highly patterned by kin and non-kin functions, or kin and friend functions. So is there any evidence for this? Oh, okay, one more theoretical assumption here, and it's important. This would suggest that social ties are not interchangeable, right? That's a very strong claim that Robert Weiss makes formally in some of his writings, that what friends do cannot substitute readily for what kin do, and vice versa. What that would mean then is that some constraints may exist on the processes of substitution and compensation. So there's a little bit of evidence in the literature that's consistent with this idea. It hasn't been examined extensively, and maybe with good reason. Maybe it doesn't have that much to contribute. But it's interesting to think about, I think. So Bookwala and her colleagues compared older adults who became widowed versus remained married over a 12-year period. And she found that among the widowed, but not among the married, having a friend confidant was protective of health. And this was not significant for family confidants. And her interpretation was that this data like this, right, go by too quickly, data like this suggests that different members of the social network perform distinctive functions. And she would have argued, or did argue, I think, in her paper, that friends may be better suited than family members to providing confidant support or intimate emotional support. The married, in contrast, and why you didn't see a similar pattern, a protective pattern for the married, is they have less need for protective buffering because the spouse performs a broad range of functions. That's empirically testable. We have found that in some of our own studies. Sort of you can score how many functions the spouse is performing versus other network members. I don't present data on that today, but we have found exactly that. But we also found, we did try to look at this notion of relationship specialization in one of our own data sets. That's a nationwide sample of older adults using a network eliciting method, very much like the one that Ben described. We asked people who performs different functions in their lives, and we asked them about support functions, emotional support, instrumental support. We asked about companionship. We didn't ask about social control, and we did ask about negative exchanges, but that's not included in these sort of theoretical discussions of relationship specialization. There's not some thinking that there are people who are well-suited to performing negative functions in your life. So it's really focused on the positive functions. So we found that unmarried older adults who did not have friends as companions were less lonely if they had family members who were companions. That's a challenge for this view, right? It's not consistent with the relationship specialization thinking that somehow friends are the most effective sources of companionship. So in our study, we didn't find support for this notion in that regard. We found that older adults who lacked family providers, again, the kin, family are supposed to be the paramount sources of instrumental support, right? We found that those who lacked, and this was true for married and non-married, so this was both groups in our sample, those who lacked family members to provide instrumental support were not less lonely if they had friends who provided instrumental support. So it suggests that this would support the view. This would be consistent with the relationship specialization idea that family members are the most effective source of instrumental support and that friends cannot easily substitute. And there's a little asterisk here, and it's something I'll return to briefly at the very end of the talk. This is kind of an important issue in view of declining rates of marriage and childbearing in recent decades. These are the customary sources of instrumental support, and rates of marriage and childbearing have been declining not only in the US, but also in many Western European countries, I think possibly in Japan. I'm not certain of all the countries, but it's very marked changes. Will new sources of instrumental support emerge for people in later adulthood? So it's possible then that in terms of this broader question of why did we not find evidence of social network compensation following the death of a spouse in our study. We had a number of reasons, and I just ended with this notion that relationship specialization might constrain the prospects for social network compensation to some extent. Okay, 10 minutes, I think I've got this. Other obstacles may also exist. There could be lack of opportunities to meet similar others, limited skill or prior experience, or lack of experience forming and maintaining new social ties could also be an issue, or inhibition could be a challenge or an issue here. So paradoxically, loneliness is associated both with a yearning for closer ties or more social ties, but also with reluctance to pursue social ties. And we'll take a little glimpse into this paradox, and it's some data that we've been working with from this same study I mentioned, nationwide study of older adults. In-person interviews assessed participants' social networks, psychological health, and in a subsample of the participants, we assessed their interest, effort, and perceived success in maintaining new ties or rekindling dormant ties. And we use sort of sensible language, right, to explain to them what we meant by rekindling a social tie or forming a new tie. Our initial analyses confirmed that loneliness is related to lower psychological health. It's related to lower positive affect, greater negative affect, and less companionship with others. So you might think that loneliness would, in fact, motivate efforts to expand social ties, but that's not what we found. So we found in this study that lonely older adults reported less interest, less effort, and less success in making new social ties. And each column in this table shows the results of a regression analysis that controlled for a bunch of things and then looked at loneliness, predicting each of these facets of sort of expanding social ties. And this was focused on making new ties. So the lonelier older adults, again, expressed less interest, less effort, and reported less success in their efforts to expand their social tie. Again, this was a little surprising to us. We had not expected exactly these results. If we look at a different dependent variable, so not making new ties, but instead rekindling social ties, same pattern. Okay, so the lonelier older adults expressed less interest, devoted less effort, and reported less success in seeking to rekindle dormant ties. These findings actually mirror those that are found in young adults. So is there a common underlying cause? And again, it's this kind of paradox. So their rates of loneliness are fairly high in young adulthood. You might think that that would drive a desire to expand social ties. And you find in a number of different studies that that's not the case, that there's a lot of inhibition and hesitation. And underlying cause is often thought to be social anxiety in young adults. And so is that the same case here or not? So other studies do indicate, on the other hand, there's mixed evidence, right, about expanding social ties. And here I'll cite Ben's wonderful work with his colleagues. Other studies do indicate that many older adults experience gains as well as losses in their social networks. I will say that this work has not typically examined purposeful efforts to expand social ties, or maybe not the context of loneliness, although you might have data on that that would be quite interesting if you have loneliness measure to look at that. So in our study, some older adults did succeed, right? There were these negative associations with interest, effort, and success, but there were some who did succeed in expanding their social ties, but others clearly tried and failed. And when social ties cannot be expanded, or when they fail to boost well-being, what other compensatory processes might help to preserve well-being? These are some possibilities derived from the literature. So there could be an adjustment, conscious or unconscious, of social needs or aspirations, minimizing the need for companionship, for example. There could be a substitution via surrogate or parasocial ties or interactions, ties with pets, television characters, and so forth. There could be substitution via technology-based social contact. I know you had a speaker recently who talked about technology in older adults' lives, including, I think, meeting some social needs. So online contacts, socially assistive robots. Or possibly, this is a little far-fetched, but I think it's worth throwing out there, engagement in non-social activities. So are there activities that would afford some satisfaction in older adults' lives that don't require a partner? So here are some examples of each one of these, and I think I will finish on time. I know I'll get the cards soon. Okay, we've got this. So these are some examples I like from a study, older study by Johnson and Troll, of older adults potentially changing their criteria for friendship. Right, so the standards or aspirations change. Face-to-face contact may no longer be required. So one participant in this sample of people aged 85 and older said, "My best friend calls me every morning at 8 a.m. Neither of us can get out much anymore." So face-to-face contact no longer required. This is 1994, before all this social media stuff. Right? It's also possible that the criteria used to define friendships modify, become broader. So one participant said, "Oh yes, I have a friend. She's the one who brings me my meals." The expressive content of friendship could be minimized. So another participant said, "With my new friend, I don't talk about my thoughts. I just talk about what I do." So is downward adjustment of relationship aspirations likely to protect emotional well-being? There's mixed views among theorists. Weiss says not likely. Minimizing social needs when a deficit exists rarely protects well-being. Baumeister and Leary would also say the same thing. They would say the need for close social bonds is universal. Disavowal is not likely to be effective. But there are other theorists who might say maybe this could be beneficial. Heckhausen and Schultz would probably say possibly. Disengaging from unattainable goals, including interpersonal goals, can preserve well-being and motivation for pursuit of other goals. I'm going to move through this kind of quickly. There is some empirical evidence, mixed evidence. So we found in one study that older adults who disavowed needing support and companionship were lonelier, right? So that disavowal did not afford protection, but there are other studies that provide hints that it could afford protection. So mixed evidence, Roche and Heckhausen found among recently separated older adults that compared to recently separated young adults, giving up the goal of forming a new partnership, which is objectively more difficult for people in midlife, did lead to some improved affect over time. Dijkstra, in a study of Dutch older adults who lacked a partner, found that perceiving a partner to be less desirable, they perceived a partner to be less desirable the longer they had been without a partner. So they're kind of ratcheting down the desirability of having a partner as a function of not having had one for a long time. Importantly, they were less likely to report loneliness if they did so. Okay, wrapping this up really quickly now. Is substitution via surrogate social ties likely to protect well-being? These would be non-human others, pets, robots, discussed briefly in a minute, media figures, television actors. These potential compensatory benefits of surrogate social ties have been posited in literature a lot. Actually, if you dig into this literature, you'll find articles with titles like this where they assert this substitutability. And that these kinds of ties can substitute or compensate, they say, for real-life interaction. This is just one study I found. This was young adults who turned to their favorite television programs when they felt lonely, reported less loneliness. There's little research on the compensatory benefits in the context of social losses in later life of these kinds of surrogate ties. And yes, okay. An important question, I think, too, is whether the surrogate contacts suppress or fulfill the need for companionship. Sort of subtle, but maybe worth pondering. This, if you can see this is just some information indicating that technology use is growing markedly among older adults, a Pew Research study. The darker line is rates of use among older adults of different kinds of technology, internet, smartphone, tablets, et cetera. So can the technology-based social contacts potentially afford some compensatory benefits? There's some thinking in the literature that smartphones, video calls, Skype calls, et cetera, might facilitate social engagement, in particular, might facilitate the maintenance of existing ties. Different kinds of technology, chat rooms, internet support groups that people can drop into might facilitate possibly forming new social ties. These could help to overcome, these types of technology could help to overcome barriers of geographic distance, mobility limitations, possibly reducing loneliness and isolation. But Antonucci cautions that they can also expose people to insensitive or negative communication. Socially assisted robots, you had a speaker who talked about this with actual expertise, like me, a year ago. I think that, this is Paro, the little robot that looks like a harp seal. There's some promising evidence, especially for isolated, depressed, or cognitively impaired older adults, but the current evidence is mixed based on a recent review by Khosravi. So non-social activities, could they contribute to well-being, hobbies, enjoyable solitary activities? Training in solitude skill has actually sometimes been recommended as a possible treatment for persistent loneliness. I won't delve into why that's been posited, but it's sort of interesting. There's a logic to it, even though it seems counterintuitive. But little research has examined the implications for long-term adaptation to losses in later life. So just to summarize, social network compensation subsumes processes and outcomes. Substitution per se does not guarantee compensatory benefits. It's important for us to learn when and why are particular compensatory processes likely to be beneficial, and partial compensation may be most feasible in many instances. It's a benefit nonetheless. Partial compensation is better than none, but what's the boundary between partial compensation and unsuccessful compensation? And what research designs can best detect compensation? When compensation is unsuccessful, what alternatives may help to protect well-being? Now I'll take 60 seconds, I promise not more, just to really conclude on a final thought, which is about aging and social network versatility in an era of daunting global challenges. So aging is always embedded in historical context, and it's unfolding today in the context of some daunting global challenges. And here I'm really illustrating this with challenges associated with climate change, tremendous floods, fires, heat waves. Many of these affect older adults to a greater extent than other age groups. And this is all occurring in the context of declining rates of marriage and childbearing, which may leave some older adults without customary sources of instrumental support and care at the very time when that's really crucial. Sibling ties and non-kin ties are becoming more important as sources of support in older adults' lives, and new models of partnership, the living apart together model, for example, are gaining popularity. But will these ties have the sustained care-providing capacity and commitment needed to assist older adults when physical limitations and health problems mount, and when these problems are compounded by daunting threats, such as those posed by climate change? So social networks may be more important than ever in the future, and investigating their versatility will deepen our understanding of compensation as a fundamental element of human adaptation. So, thank you very much. Yes.
I have this. Great talk, very interesting. I had a question. As I was listening to you, and I was thinking about what we know about adaptation to widowhood. And we know that by and large, if people had better marriages, they seem to have more difficulty adapting than people who had less happy marriages, because we can't assume that because people stayed married, that means their marriages were happy ones. And your talk made me wonder whether perhaps that pattern that we're seeing what might be underlying it is perhaps that widows who recently widowed, particularly women who had unhappy marriages, perhaps they tried different avenues of substitution and perhaps are more successful at those. I mean, I could. I'm always kind of a competing hypothesis, so I could imagine it going either way. But I wouldn't be surprised if marital quality prior to the becoming widowed actually produced differences in those avenues of substitution. I'm wondering if you've looked at that or what you think about it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And like so many studies of widowhood, participants were recruited after the spouse had died. So we don't have the pre-loss information about the marital quality, or for that matter, the participant's psychological well-being. So we tried to get them relatively soon after the spouse had died, but not beforehand. It's what makes the CALC study, right, so interesting. Yes. And I looked at the CALC. This is Changing Lives of Older Couples, but it's one of the few studies that actually tracks older adults over time, just for a very, very long period of time, assessing their pre-loss, married adults over time, assessing their pre-loss well-being, and essentially kind of waiting for the loss of a spouse to occur, and then mobilizing their assessment teams quickly when that does happen, and getting them into the field to then look at the processes of adaptation over time. It's one of the few studies, perhaps the only study with a really well-defined sample that I think has that pre-loss information about the quality of the marriage and also about the well-being. I've looked at that along with some secondary analysis possible, but I think in my case they assessed, for what I would be testing, they assessed emotional support. They may have assessed instrumental support, but not companionship.
Yeah.
And sadly, companionship, I think, is also what drives people to feel lonely and what might drive them to seek alternate ties. So we didn't feel that we could test some of the questions that would have been drilling into with a better sample, with really a better design than the one we had, to look at substitution and compensation, unfortunately. But it's a great question.
Yeah,
We
this-
need more studies like that. It was, I think their study was hugely expensive and difficult to mount and track, but it's useful for exactly those
Oh,
reasons.
it was, yeah, I think the clock data are great, but they don't ask those questions that you're asking that I think
Yeah.
are so important. It may
Yeah.
help explain some of the patterns that the clock data show.
Yeah, no, they look at the trajectories of psychological adjustment to widowhood over time, and there you see the very different patterns, so that some people improve, their psychological well-being increases, and it could be freedom from a bad marriage. It's often, I think, that there was caregiving involved, so there was a spouse who died after a long trajectory of illness, and so they're released from seeing the spouse suffering and also from the caregiving burden at the same time. But they certainly illustrate and map these different trajectories, and I don't think that data set, unless I've missed, I don't think it has in it what I would love to be able to get my hands on to do a better job, because I'm not 100%, convinced that the data we presented here would always be the last word, that somehow substitution that occurs after widowhood is bad for you,
That might be very
or
good.
associated, I think there need to be, it was surprising to us. We tried to turn the shovel many times in the soil to figure out what's going on. Is this a fluke? What is it? But it was, it's just one study, and there needs to be much more work. And I could certainly imagine that the kind of turbulence and the turnover and the rebalancing that you talked about would, for many older adults, you've got a bigger and a better sample, I think, than ours, would yield psychological benefits.
One last thought, if you put that together with the thought about elder abuse, since we know most elder abuse is actually spousal abuse that's continued from earlier years, it may also be that widowhood there may be a gatekeeper to other relationships that is now ended because that spousal abuse ended because the spouse died. So lots of putting your two talks together, lots of fascinating stuff.
I mean, one idea I had, it's not exactly what you were asking before, but as a kind of another interpretation, I was puzzling over this, and preparing this talk. Why were those findings so contradictory? It's also possible that the widows themselves were not seeking additions to their networks, but the network members, the gatekeepers, felt that there was a need for them to have more visits by the children, or so there could have been some imposition potentially of social ties that were not ones that they desired themselves or had tried to seek themselves. We don't have data about that, but it's a conjecture about why would you then potentially see negative effects as opposed to null or beneficial effects. But,
I was wondering exactly about that negative effect question. I mean, I was thinking two things. On one hand, if you had a particularly satisfying long marriage, there's no way, that's always going to be in the back of your mind as this comparison point with a new
Yes.
tie.
Yes.
And maybe can increase your
Yes.
negative feeling about sort of an innocent new tie.
Yeah.
But also, I was curious, too, along the same lines, this lonelier people are actually reluctant to expend effort to meet new ties. Do you think it could be that you've spent so long in a long-term relationship that you've actually lost the skills for this and hence the confidence for this? I imagine there must be some research on this, and it could be a point of intervention, it seems.
Well, it would be consistent with the ideas that are put forth in the literature on young adulthood, that there's either there are limited skills or there's social anxiety that gets in the way. And so then one needs interventions to address the anxiety and to build the skills and to build the confidence and to make people feel less at risk, when they venture into new situations and put themselves out to try to forge a new tie. So I think that something like that could be pursued. Again, this researcher, Nan Stevens in the Netherlands, has done some nice studies, small studies, but interesting and very informative, where older women who, they don't say, are you lonely, would you like to come into an intervention, but they're basically posing a question about, would you like to have more friends, yada, yada, and then they screen them and they bring in to the study people who are high in loneliness. And they do all kinds of things, I think, in her interventions to help them sort of practice social skills and just to become more comfortable, and to have sort of, an exercise each week. I'm going to remember now also an interesting, purely qualitative set of observations, but kind of fascinating, by Robert Weiss, who was a really prominent loneliness researcher in the 1970s, and his writings to me are always full of amazing insights and bear revisiting many times over. But he was, I don't know if he was a clinical psychologist, but he was involved in running some groups, I think, for widowed individuals, most of whom were elderly. And so how do you run a group? So the groups were structured to be discussion, their feelings and how they might kind of move forward. He reports that what they really loved was the donuts and the coffee. They loved that first 15 minutes that were just the informal socializing, where it wasn't all, I'm sharing my feelings to you, you're sharing your feelings to me. They liked the practice socializing, and mingling, and it was facilitated by, having coffee and refreshments. So that's a little bit consistent with how do you break the ice, how do you get people comfortable, and maybe the one-on-one disclosure of I feel sad and I feel worried about meeting people is less effective than just creating some opportunities. So I love the work. I think these are sociologists, Mark Pilasuk and Meredith Minkler have a book called Unintentional Networks. Is that what it's called? There's a lot of demonstration projects where they focused on older adults who were isolated and lonely to some extent. They were, I think, or still are at UC Davis. And they had the idea that if you focused explicitly on tackling the person's loneliness and making that very upfront, you're going to turn off and turn away people who are kind of hesitant to begin with, for whom loneliness might have been a longstanding issue. So they would create these sort of structures or opportunities for people to interact. And an example they gave was called the Senior Gleaner Program. I don't know if this still exists, but the Senior Gleaners are people who go out into the fields, older adults who go into the agricultural fields around Davis, or did at that time, after the harvest had occurred. And they would glean the leftover stuff, and then they would take the produce that would otherwise go to waste, and they would distribute that to various sort of needy organizations in San Francisco and the Bay Area. What was of interest to Pilasuk and his colleague Minkler was not how much got distributed, but rather people had to coordinate, interact. They had to plan how they were going to go up and down these rows. They had to plan how they were going to get the trucks loaded and do all of that. And they tracked their social ties over time and found that kind of collaboration, having a shared task where the focus was on not on themselves and kind of their isolation, but rather on this shared task and having to coordinate and cooperate, was conducive to friendship formation. They present a few other kind of demonstration projects like that I just always thought were really smart and very interesting. So that's a little far afield from the question, but it's some things that come to mind. So.
This will be our last question, too.
Lucky. Thank you so much. Okay, this is, I have to use your microphone. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in your discussion of technology substitutes following the loss of a partner. And I was thinking about, so you cited the example of someone who calls their best friend every morning at the same time. And I'm thinking about sort of cohorts that are more integrated with technology as they grow older, what that will look like now that we have Facebook and texting and family group chats and all of that. And I think about phone calls being a site where there's space for a lot of intimate personal discussion. You kind of feel chosen when someone calls you, and there's, you spend that time together, and it can have different maybe effects on loneliness. But whereas, and so now that we have more opportunities for social engagement, but also they don't allow that kind of richness and intimacy. With Facebook, you can be so socially integrated and still feel like an outsider within that space, sort of. I think about, as more technologically integrated cohorts grow older and might turn to those sorts of substitutes as opposed to interpersonal exchanges like a phone call.
do you see that as maybe having positive impacts for loneliness, negative? Like I'm sort of wondering
Yeah.
the
It's a really,
balance between
it's
that.
a sophisticated and a nuanced, an interesting question that you raise. I guess I would say I think that there is a lot of potential, especially for future cohorts, your generation, or the generation just ahead of you, when you reach old age, who will have been using this kind of technology your whole lives to maintain ties. A little less certain about forming new ties. I still think there's that risk, it's anonymity and all of that, but that remains to be seen, whether those would be mechanisms conducive, or technologies conducive to the formation of ties, in addition to just the maintenance, being able to connect with family, connect with your friends all around the world. But it seems to me that it could be beneficial, and certainly would overcome limitations, mobility limitations, housebound older adults, who can now turn to these sources of connection. I think, I'm not an expert on this, you had the expert last year, but I think I was trying to read a handful of articles in preparing the talk, and I thought I read an article that said that this works better for older adults, this sort of technology stuff, if they also have some in-person interaction in their lives. So that, it might have been in Antonucci's paper, I think, said it can't replace in-person interaction, but it could augment. I don't know. I mean, that's a hypothesis that could be tested. And of course, the nagging concern I have in the back of my mind is always, none of this is an arena in which hands-on instrumental support can be exchanged. So who will help with the wheelchair transfers? None of that, that kind of hands-on instrumental support, worries me with continued population aging and then some of the challenges that lie on the horizon for people who reach old age, not having at least, again, the customary or traditional sources of instrumental support. How will that play out? So I think, getting more nuanced than I've been in this talk about different kinds of outcomes. Whether it's psychological health, again, confessed, guilty psychologists, we always go right to that place. But there are many other needs that social ties meet, and including that very important provision of instrumental care. And there's a lot in flux there in that regard. I may be limited, but I don't see a mechanism for the technology-based social ties to provide tangible care. Advice, information, yes, but the kind of tangible assistance, I don't know. But maybe that will come, and haven't thought about it. Need the robots, that's right. Oh, that's true. I didn't think about the robots. And that it's quite amazing how rapidly that literature is developing. So it was an Alice down the rabbit hole experience for me, but it's an interesting rabbit hole. If you jump into it, you'll find that there's quite a bit there. So a really great question. It's a lot of future casting, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about with those technologies. And then I still worry about who's providing the instrumental care if families are shrinking and some of the, will it be there when people need it? Yeah, yeah.
Programming your robot to do the things. That's
very funny.
On the phone, and she can use your phone to also get the robot to do what it needs to do. So maybe you can get both, even if your daughter lives in Nashville or wherever.
Yeah. Well, these are great questions. Thank you so much again. Appreciate it.
This was great, wasn't it? Did you have a good time? Yeah? Yeah, thank you. We're delighted that you could join us today, and we have other topics related to this topic that I want to draw to your attention. Some of you are headed to the Gerontological Society of America meeting in November, and I just want to draw to your attention that the theme for that meeting is Strength in Age, Harnessing the Power of Networks. So I think, and that was proposed by a biologist. I want you to know that too. So I think people are paying attention to the social fabric of our existence, and very important thing. We also want you to take some time, if you would, in the next few moments to fill out the feedback form. This really is helpful to us to just give us a sense of how the day met your needs. And we also recycle name tags, so you can drop them on a table, or there's a box back there somewhere. I think we might have benefited a lot from this day, but I also want you to shower a bit of praise with me on some people who helped to make it happen. And first and foremost is Paige Ebner, our assistant director of the Center on Aging and Life course. So Paige has just done a fabulous job of organizing today, covering a million details and exigencies along the way. And so I really appreciate your help, Paige. Thank you. I also want you to note that our graduate students are indispensable. They're bright, they're hardworking, and they help us in tangible ways. So you might not realize it, but escorts and timekeepers and registration help, et cetera, thank you. We really do appreciate the time and the effort that you put into that, so I'm deeply grateful. And then a special thanks to our poster presenters who were here at 7:45 to make it a nice venue for you. I want to close with a couple comments about something called an age-friendly university. So the past year, Purdue University decided that we wanted to affiliate with a global network of universities that are described as age-friendly. And you might be asking, what does that mean? I'm not going to go through the details of it, but it's a voluntary commitment, but also a way of raising awareness and raising the bar for what is an age-friendly university. So in notions of it, it's to recognize that age is oftentimes an unrecognized axis of inclusion or exclusion, and it is a way in which we can make diversity come alive on this campus and elsewhere. So it's thinking about not just faculty, but if faculty are older adults and they want to continue to contribute their ideas and their work, we want to support them. We want to be an age-friendly university that supports them. Some of you may or may not know that some countries do not permit faculty to work past an age. There's actually mandatory retirement. In the United States, we are quite fortunate to have laws against that. But there's more than just the law, right? There's the environment. Some people that want to come to be subjects in your studies, you want them to come to campus. And sometimes it's daunting for older adults to come to campus. And so a big issue I hear is, how do I get my subjects on campus? How do I make that a more welcoming environment? When we think of students, some students are older students returning to class, and we want to welcome them very warmly. We want to extend that opportunity because I think that our classrooms are richer by having those older students in there. I was a student and had that kind of experience, and I still remember George Birch asking lots of questions that raised the level of conversation in classes. So, number one, we became a member of this global network this year, but we are in the process now of trying to think of raising the bar and raising awareness. And we have one graduate student by the name of M.K. Huffman who was just handling the mic, and she came to us with an idea. And her idea was pretty revolutionary. She had an idea for a very short video that would just send the message about age-friendly universities. And I thought, well, we're not really in the business of making videos, but let's go for it. So I turned it over to Paige and I said, work with MK, and the two of them really brought this together. So we're going to leave you with the video. That will be our salutation, right? This is the exclamation point for the day. Remember, social integration across the ages. Age integration. Let's see the video.